discussing how to handle things that are frustrating and potential solutions. But Blake, I mean, I totally agree that's what makes it so difficult, because they are such consequential and serious issues and actions. But again, it's like, what approach is the most effective? And, you know, to Herson's point, it's like, they told it when I first started my career in financial sales, basically wealth management. You know, my superior said people love to buy, but they hate to be sold, right? You know, 101 of sales. And so giving someone the hardcore persuasive pitch, there's a lot of resistance to that. Whereas, you know, and this doesn't necessarily, you're not going to get the satisfaction of saving every person you meet. But if you live a life that's healthy and well balanced, and you're calm and you're successful and you're finding meaning and you're building, you know, the life that you want for yourself, that's going to attract the attention of onlookers, and they're going to ask themselves, you don't even have to be involved in that process. They're going to ask themselves, how is that guy doing that? How is that person establishing that? Because everyone wants peace and happiness and good relationships and longevity and health and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, tangly issue, and anyone who's listening now is probably just totally confused. So
what we're talking about.
Anyways, so we're here to ostensibly discuss the book When Money Dies by Adam Fergusson, which was actually written in 1975. Boom, there it is. Obviously a timely book for our current times, and I think that's why we decided to put this together, because there's a lot of obvious parallels between what happened basically in Weimar Germany in the aftermath of the First World War and what's happening now. And so I thought it would be fun to get together with some homies and discuss it. So how should we get this kicked off? Do you want to just go kind of first impressions of the book around the table, and presumably that'll spark some lively conversation? Blake,
Sure.
why don't you get us started off?
Well, it was a long book. It was repetitive, and it was depressing. So I don't know if anyone else felt that way. But it felt crucial to read it because there's a lot of parallels with what's going on. And there's not a lot of books about when money dies or when money starts to hyperinflate away. And so there's, again, a lot of parallels to what's going on now in society and in areas that are really hyperinflating, and then in the United States as well, which were slowly inflating away. And you see these parallels. So you really need to, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And there's a lot of rhyming that's going on, and it gives you clarity into what's going to happen and gives you peace, because you do know what's going to happen. You can expect that going on, because it's a very repeatable, process where things in society will break down. There's something obviously it's going to be new, which is Bitcoin. So that's going to add some conversation to this, where we can kind of look at these use cases and see, draw parallels for what's going on. So that was the kind of the big thing for me is, one, that it was dry. It's a tough read. So this podcast is great for figuring out the parallels and then the action items. And, that's what I like to focus on, is like, what can we do moving forward, after this call, after this discussion, what we can take away from an individual perspective and sharing that with our friends. So that's kind of my takeaway with the book.
Johnny?
So I just initial takeaways. I mean, as you read it, the idea of like the frog in a boiling pot of water comes to mind, but it also you think the frog is done boiling and it just keeps going, and then now it's in a frying pan, and then the oil, then the water all evaporates, and now it's on fire, and then they put it in lava, and then they fucking bombed it with a nuke. I mean, by the end, you're like, is this going to just keep going? And I was shocked, shocking to look at the dates too, because you're talking about months at a time. You're at one point, it's like summer, and it's like late summer, and then early fall. You're talking about weeks, months at a time, these things just getting worse and worse and worse. And the general just sort of erosion, it just reiterates again, something that I think we've all sort of learned over time, is the importance of money. So many people don't understand the true importance of money, because it's, we have all of these tropes of money is the root of all evil. And, the rich man has as much chance getting to heaven as the camel fitting through the eye of the needle. Like these ideas that money is sort of this evil thing that we should avoid, or at least not I mean, I guess in the end, it's misquoted, right? It's the love of money is the root of all evil, but still, the general theme in a lot of parts of culture is like this idea that money is bad, or the chase of money is bad. But the reality is, when money goes bad, nothing works, right? So, and that's what I really, the big takeaway from this book was sort of that foundational erosion underneath you. It's one thing to have it on a personal level. When you're broke, nothing else matters. Similar to like when you're sick, right? So if you're sick, nothing else matters except getting healthier. And just this sort of erosion of money was like a cancer on this particular culture, but you can see it, it's the same across multitudes of examples across time and history. And we're seeing something in that vein now. Is it Weimar Republic? I don't know. Is it 1970s stagflation? Maybe. But again, I think Blake quoted best as history may not repeat, but it definitely rhymes.
Yeah. And for me, I would say one of the kind of the takeaways, once I was done with the book, I was like, wow, the narrative reads like some sort of fantasy, right? Like, so just this insanely fast devaluation of a currency almost seems impossible to repeat, right? But I think part of the reason that it seems impossible is because it was however many generations ago. No one's alive anymore that actually lived through that. So every single one of us on this call and everyone listening, doesn't know anyone that was an adult at that time. You know what I mean? So there's, and I think the book maybe mentions some of this, right? There's just no, in the present day, there's no institutional or societal knowledge, like actual cardinal knowledge of going through an episode like that. So it seems impossible to us. And to John's point about the, kind of being like frogs in boiling water, that's precisely it, right? We feel like we might read a narrative like this and be like, oh, thank God that was 100 years ago, because that'll never happen again. And yet, it's quite likely to happen, or to rhyme, right? So I think to me, it was kind of fascinating that 20 years from now, we might be, recounting a similar story, that our generation went through. So I would say that was one of the more kind of surprising and the stronger takeaways for me was just how quickly or how easy it is to disregard this as a story from generations ago and something that will never happen again.
Yeah, I thought a lot of it was, John, you said repetitive. I thought a lot of it was quite boring because it was basically just kind of chronicling the devaluation. And I like the details of like what's happening to the culture, what's the thought process, what is that devaluation causing, and what's allowing that to occur? Because you just read it and you think, oh my God, it's horrible. But you have to understand that for that to have taken place, a sufficient number of people had to have basically not been aware of it or not been identifying the proper cause. And that's what they say in the book, like people thought the cause of the inflation was everything but the printing of money. And we're, from our standpoint now, we're like, how is that even possible? Like there's a direct line, you print a gajillion marks and you get, you don't print and there's not a gajillion more goods and services in the economy. The price of all those goods and services are going to go up. I mean, what's so difficult about that? And there was a bit of that, I guess the last couple chapters were a bit more commentary on the thinking that was going on in the time and the prevailing mindset and stuff like that. But I think this is why studying these historical episodes is so valuable, because history doesn't repeat. And that's the pitfall. That's history not repeating is what allows it to rhyme, because people look and say, it's not the same thing. It's not the exact same thing that's going on. And they're right. It's not the exact same thing, but so the circumstance is different and the precise mechanism might be different and all that kind of stuff. But what is the principle? Like when all the COVID hysteria stuff kicked off, I was reading a book called They Thought They Were Free, which was a look at kind of the rise of Hitler in late 20s, early 30s Germany. And, to the extent that I mentioned that, some people would push back on that. And my point, again, wasn't the exact same thing as happening. The point was which principles of governance, of morality, of whatever were violated at that time and which are being violated at this time. And should they not give us cause for pause about how quickly we move in a certain direction. Because another interesting fact about this is, okay, so war basically ends in, 1819, and, Germany's in a bad position, and they are blamed for the war, and they have war reparations, and this basically puts their economy and society into a tailspin. And then 1924 was the height of the inflation, where, like the mark to US dollar exchange rate was something absurd, like $1 billion or
Not
whatever
even anymore.
Yeah, it's just whatever it ended up being. And so things can happen really fast if you let them spiral out of control. And so I'm sure we'll talk about all the different details of that process, but to my mind, that's why a book like this is interesting and important, because we're all guilty of it, but I think maybe the people on this call and Bitcoiners more generally, if I can be so bold as to assert, that they're perhaps more thoughtful than your average person, at least in the domain of finance and economics and stuff. And a lot of us just kind of our brains connect dots far too easily. And unless we use precedent and prior examples of similar circumstances and try to extract out the insights and principles that prevailed in those circumstances, and then apply them to the current one and see if there's any parallels. If we don't do that, I think this is how we continue to fall into the same pitfalls. Now, I'm under no illusions that this conversation is going to avoid the fate that we seem to be barreling towards. But obviously Bitcoin has represents an opportunity that wasn't available to anyone ever in these circumstances that now is. And of course, many of us and many people around the world are taking advantage of that. And that's amazing. And that, that makes it really interesting to speculate, like, how does this play out differently because that's available? Because opting out is so much easier than it's ever been before in the past. And I think that does mean that the character of this phenomenon, however it's going to play out, will be quite different than those in the past. How, we can discuss, and I'd love to get your guys' opinion. But the other thing that I did, just my last point on this, the other thing I did, I read the book. I can't even remember the period now, which is embarrassing, but I read the book like 3 years ago. But it was the assignat, like the fiat currency inflation in France. I believe it was like around the revolution, maybe just prior. And a very similar thing played out, right? Ultimately, the government just issued a bunch more paper because, they wanted to spend more money, and they issued way more paper and it got out of control. And some commentary and some context for Weimar culturally. And, that's what's, I think, the most interesting parallel, because in the book, it touches on it. And then if you explore it a bit further, you had this, incredibly tumultuous period in the early 20s where the bulk of this inflation was happening and people were destitute, and there was a tremendous amount of volatility in all areas of life, a tremendous amount of uncertainty, a tremendous amount of conflict and polarization. And then in that time and in the latter part of the 20s, you had this like real interesting cultural emergence where you had people like and really entrenched aspects of all this, and I think there's parallels to that today, where you had the people that were like, no, we want to go back to the traditional way. That was the safe and stable way that, we lost as a result of the war and the inflation. And then you had this, more modernist group of people, and there was this like flourishing of modern, flourishing maybe is a little bit too subjective, but there was a lot more of like modern art and modern dance and modern literature, and like this kind of explosion of culture around the world, of course, during the 20s, but in Germany especially. And it's just interesting that like that came out of one of the most tumultuous and destructive financial and economic periods within a couple of years, so the change that occurred in that decade was tremendous. And then of course, what that led to was the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, which was a massive departure from the kind of extremely liberal culture of the late 20s. So again, that was kind of long-winded, but just to say, like, a very interesting period of history. And I think one that probably has no greater parallel than the one today, for those reasons mentioned. And many others that I'm sure we'll get into.
Well, I think like first thing that comes to mind is you were talking about hopefully it's different this time. Yeah, with Bitcoin being an option. But the thing that it was interesting for me, one of the takeaways is like maybe it's not different this time. I was reading the book and I'm like, I'm sure there's some gold bug that's sitting there being like, we just need to use gold. That's it. It's not that big a deal. We're going to use gold. And through that whole book, it's surprising to me that nobody was just like, how about we just trade in gold? You know what I mean? I'll use, whatever that medium of exchange is, but everyone kept going back to John's point, that boiling frog mindset. They just kept using that particular currency and not trying to move to something else, gold being the most obvious one. And Bitcoin would be a lot easier to use and a lot easier to exchange. But it was interesting that didn't happen. And there wasn't conversations that I remember from that book where people were talking about moving to a gold standard and exchanging in gold, especially at the business level. Maybe not at the individual level to buy your coffee, but businesses that are dealing internationally, not moving to a gold standard, I found surprising. Especially since it was such common conversation where you're trading in your gold for the local currencies as a badge of honor and pride, nationalistic pride. And that to me was, I found that surprising. And they're wearing, gold rings and gold jewelry and talking about their gold. And it never clicked for them. Just like, maybe we're just using the wrong thing. And they just kept using the wrong thing over and over and over again, which the modern parallel is concerning for me because, I thought like once inflation hits, it's going to slap everybody in the face once. And then they're going to look at Bitcoin and say, okay, it's time to do my research about this. Those crazy Bitcoiners on Twitter are right. Let's dialogue about this, but that doesn't seem to be happening. The bond market seems to be breaking in Europe. We've got hyperinflation or inflation in Europe, in the UK, in Lebanon, in Argentina, and a lot of other countries, Turkey. And it doesn't seem to, I was in Turkey about 8 months ago and it didn't seem to be waking up to that, where you thought they'd be begging to understand about Bitcoin and sound money. They were still thinking it was a volatile asset, which obviously it is, but there wasn't much more curiosity that you think they have like triple or quadruple inflation the United States has, and they'd be a little bit more curious. And it didn't correlate as much as I thought with high inflation and curiosity around Bitcoin.
Yeah, Blake, I think that's interesting. You say that because I think in terms of finding parallels between that period, the period of Weimar Germany and today, I think the book highlights how, of course, the overwhelming majority of the population is just too busy trying to put food on the table and going to work and just give me my money at the end of the work week. And have no assets, right? So they began with no assets, and similarly today, the overwhelming majority of our world is too busy at work. Give me my paycheck at the end of the week. Have no assets to transfer out of. In Weimar Germany, it was wealthy people transferring their assets out of the country to protect them. Today, perhaps it's folks who have studied Bitcoin and understanding sound money principles, starting to save in Bitcoin. But I think that to speak to parallels, probably a similar thing is going to happen, during this century, right? Where a overwhelming majority of folks just will not educate themselves, right? Either because they think they can't, it's too complicated or whatever it might be, but they're just going to faithfully go to work and give me my paycheck at the end of the work week, completely blind to the debasement of that money that's happening under their nose.
But it's not just they're not educating or even back in Weimar, it's Gresham's law, right? Bad money chases out good money. People are going to get rid of and use bad money and hold on to or try to store in good money. So, and money in this case could mean gold, but it also, like in this book, talk about farmers, people who have saleable goods, that was their money, right? That was their store value, because you couldn't, getting access to gold may or may not have been easy for people in general. But if you lived in the country and you had real estate, or you had, if you had farmland and you had something you could produce on your land, that was your real store value. Where the people, it was like this, I always think of Russia, when you think about the collapse of, communist Russia and what happened to the urban, quote unquote, urban jobs. And a lot of that is in this book, right? Like urban jobs are supported when the basic needs are taken care of, right? When you can put food on the table easily, when you trade your money for food, like we do, right? I live in a city, and so I don't have any access to food other than going to the grocery store and being able to purchase it. But if you don't have that ability, then the entire urban idea falls apart, right? Because until I can provide food, I can't go be a professor. I can't go be, a financial advisor. I can't go be a lot of things that exist only after that basic foundational support of I can feed myself occurs. And that's what happened in Weimar, was the basic foundational idea of being able to provide myself with health and safety through the exchange of my government paper completely collapsed. And so the whole urban idea collapsed in that way. And I brought up communist Russia because you look at people with PhDs in communist finance, something that does not exist, right? That this entire people went to school for 10 years to become a communist finance doctor, and then communist Russia falls apart, and doesn't exist. It completely collapses, completely erodes. When the basic foundational premise of your entire society falls apart because you can't feed yourself, then all of those things that people have put their time and energy and money and traded their time, energy, and money for become completely irrelevant. Which I find, and that's how this idea of Gresham's law and that they just found gold. Well, because of that reparations payment that's hanging over, and to talk about dismissing this whole book, right? Somebody who reads this book and wants to say it'll never happen here, that's what they'll use, right? They'll just say, well, they were under this reparations payment from World War I, and without that, this would have never happened. They would have had more control over their financial destiny and all that stuff. And to an extent, sure, that's true. I mean, that's what we're taught in 8th grade social studies, right? Like World War I happened, these really sort of restricting reparations payments were put onto the Germans. They couldn't pay them back. That allowed Hitler to come in, and World War II happens. World War I happens, yada, yada, yada. You can yada, yada, yada about 15 years of history in there, and then Hitler and World War II. But you can look at now and go, well, America's not under any reparations payments, so we don't have that same struggle. But okay, what could you consider to be a reparations payment that we've put ourselves under? Social Security, debt to GDP, global debt, exports and debt that we have to Chinese. I mean, you name it, and you hear guys on Twitter, Preston Pish and bond markets and experts in bonds and long-term debt, and they're screaming it, right? I think Stanley Druckenmiller had a great quote the other day. He was being interviewed and it made its way around, and he said, he was essentially saying, which anybody who's paying attention for a long enough period of time, is we're not gonna be able to service the debt, right? We're getting to a point where we're not be able to service the debt. And you're talking about Ray Dalio and the end of these massive 250-year debt cycles and some sort of fourth turning, or if you're a Bitcoiner, a fifth turning. But he asked him, what are you investing in? And he said, well, I bought some cyanide. This is the idea of the boomers, right? Like the boomer generation is not going to have to live through this for the most part. I mean, they're probably going to feel some of the pain, but they got to live relatively unscathed, and then we'll have to kind of fight through it. And so the question is, will Bitcoin provide us, nothing's going to save us from the coming financial reorganization of the entire globe, right? But does Bitcoin provide us some safety? And I think, yes, and the equivalent in this book, you basically, as a Bitcoiner, get to become a foreign citizen to your own country, right? So like these Germans, if they could have become French, they would have done it in a heartbeat, right? If they could have saved, because it talks about, let's see, what page do I have it on? Basically, page 23. Yeah, so page 23, it talks about furniture, fittings, pianos, carpets were being bought up wholesale by what were known as gold currency people, the occupying Italians, the British, and the Americans. And when I read that, I couldn't help but think of, African agri-beads and how the British, because they had better technology, were able to just go and make glass beads and essentially conquer the entire continent of Africa. And that was similar in this case because they had no other way to save their value. The Italians, the French, they would come in as tourists, they would buy up whatever they wanted for nothing and then leave with it. And the Germans had no way to save that. So what did they do? They had spend it as quickly as possible, just like we see time and time again across, whether you want to look at an African nation or South American, Argentina, whatever. But in this case, you and I, the four people in this room, people who are listening, Bitcoiners in general, I get to say I'm essentially giving up my US citizenship to go be a Bitcoin sovereign individual, and I can save mine away from the malfeasance of my financial dictators or those who dictate our financial policy. And I just keep talking. Yeah.
No, it's all good points and well said. I think, in these, and your point about cities is absolutely true. And so they devolved into, at first, barter and stuff. But the punchline with cities is that they're premised on reliable coordination. And when the very mechanism of coordination breaks down, the thing that's relying on it breaks down as well. And that's, there are many examples of that. But what's so fascinating to me about all this is the psychology involved. So for the four of us here and many other Bitcoiners, once we realize the fraudulent nature or the inevitable collapse or however you want to characterize it of the existing monetary system, we made a decision. Now, some of us, that was in advance of Bitcoin, and maybe we became gold bugs because that was the only option. Maybe Bitcoin was around and we could just go into Bitcoin, but it was almost like a principled decision. Like, this is predicated on an unsustainable foundation or axioms. It's going to fail. I need a solution. I found a solution. I'm taking the solution. And, there were people in Germany at the time that did that, converted all their wealth to a hard asset like gold or precious metals. There's people in late 20s, early 30s Germany, when Hitler came to power, they got the fuck out immediately. So like certain people that are paying more attention and maybe even more principally oriented. So they said when someone like Hitler came to power and everything he was espousing, they said, I'm not about this. This is a dangerous road. I'm out. But so like the majority of people, and they talk about this in the book, or Adam talks about this in the book, there's so many reasons for the frog boiling in water. And there's so many reasons why we get these scenarios where it's death by 1,000 cuts. Because one, people think it's going to go back to normal. That's like one of the first ones. Like, oh, this is a short-term aberration. The political dynamic will go back to normal. The monetary, the economic, everything will revert back to something I'm more, used to, and that's more acceptable to me. And then there's the case that there's so much obfuscation in the system. Like I said before, like they were blaming everything except for the printing of money, right? And they were fudging all the numbers. They say in the book as well that the CPI, effectively what it was at the time, they were having to fudge in order to make it seem like things weren't as bad as they were. And so like between all that chaos and all that distortion, I'm sure a lot of people have a difficult time in identifying like not only what is the cause, but what is the appropriate solution, and then the other thing, I went through the history. There's a Wikipedia page and it's the chronology of like Weimar Germany. And it's got like, a bunch of points that are uninteresting. It's like this law was passed and this passed and this passed and this passed and this passed. But to me, it just impressed upon me, like, all of this stuff, whether we're talking about hyperinflation, whether we're talking about rise to power of fill in the blank tyrant, there's so many steps that lead up to it. And when we look back in hindsight on history, we tend to think it's so simple. Oh, bad guy came to power, people swallowed the Kool-Aid. Why didn't they see it? And it's because like culture is such a dynamic thing, and culture kind of possesses us, right? Like we're all possessed with a certain element of the zeitgeist of the culture, if you want to call it that. And some of us try to extract ourselves from that. Some of us try to see more clearly. We try to see beyond it or see outside of it because we recognize how dangerous it can be to be fully kind of fully adopt that cultural perspective, like a narrow cultural perspective. But that's one of the things that is lost on people, and why I think, of course, these these books and these discussions are important. And the last thing I wanted to say was, one of the interesting things that came out of this time in the 20s was like a dramatic increase in social services and, social promises and all that kind of stuff by the state. And of course, right? Because when times are really bad, if you're the type of person that thinks that the government is the one that's meant to fix those things, that's most meant to step in and fix them for you, then there's a huge chorus of people asking for it. And so one, you think that's my solution, not opting out. So you're over-indexing on the former rather than the latter. And two, you're giving the government more and more reason to engage in the activity that's actually impoverishing you in the first place, which is the more rampant printing of money in order to fulfill those promises. And so the whole scenario creates a downward spiral for itself. And if you're attached to that, if you're aligned with that, if that's how where you see your salvation, then you're going to go down with the ship. And the other option is of course not aligning with that and knowing that you have to save yourself, and then you're going to look for other options. And of course, there was there was a lot of people at the time that I'm sure did that, but the majority of people were part of the going down with the ship group.
Yeah, and I think that nowadays, in this generation, there's there's 60, 70-year-olds, at least here in this country, in the States, that are accustomed to, from birth until today, have had some sort of, to your point, John, some sort of subsidy, some sort of support that they've now become, dependent on, right? And so to take that away, there's how do you square that circle if you're that person, if that's the only mindset, or if the only experience you've ever had is to have that government support, then you're going to clamor and you're going to cheer on like in California, I think another $1,000 stimulus check type of thing has just been issued to literally to quote unquote fight inflation. You're going to cheer that on because that's the only thing you've ever, known. And it's tragic, right? Because this is the ship going down and bringing down, an incredible amount of people with it that are, probably unwilling to think in different terms.
Well, the irony with that is like that the problem, they're printing money to give a check to people, right? And the problem is the printing of money. So it's like It's like saying the solution to the Titanic is going and knocking another hole in the steel of the ship. Like that's exactly what's happening. And the irony there is that like they're getting people to do it to themselves and getting people to vote in that mindset, which is just the weirdest thing. We're going to fix this by printing more money. We're going to fix inflation by printing more money. Inflation is printing more money. You can't fix it by printing more money. And so that's an amazing statement that you made, because there's just such a disconnect between cause and effect that people just refuse to realize for some reason. A lot of it is going to be obviously education and studying history, but people don't get that general concept. And for whatever reason, it's not really on the internet. There's not really great content about what is inflation on the internet. Even in the Bitcoin space, my biggest frustration is everyone continues to talk about inflation as the price of goods going up versus the real definition, which is the fact that money is being printed. We still do that in the Bitcoin space, and a lot of our thought leaders continue to do that. And it's my biggest pet peeve, right? Because we continue to talk about it like that matters, and we conflate the terms. And so we're still guilty of that even now. And that's something that it helps you understand why it's so hard for people to grasp this, because the powers to be, so to speak, are really good at conflating all these things together. And most Bitcoiners would have been able to tell you that inflation is going to happen when they did, 2 trillion of money printing 2 years ago, and then the prices are going to come up. And now they've just been waiting for that to happen. And now inflation's coming into the ethos, people are talking about it more. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Well, to give a very clear current modern day example. This goes back to your point, Blake, of like people not being educated, or, we see this through a certain lens because we're paying a lot of attention and because we're Bitcoiners, and we're very sensitive to history and historical examples. But the DoD, Department of Defense, just for the second year picked certain locales that the cost of real estate has gone up too much in the last year, and have issued a higher cost of living adjustment. So last year it was, I think, 15 different locations. This year it's 20 different locations. So some people's housing allowance went up. Now it usually goes up every year in January, whatever percent, 5%, depending on where you're supposed to live. It never keeps up with the cost of living. But we just got they just provided a new increase in October, an emergency increase of, in some cases, 25 to 30% increase. So I see that, and what are my initial thoughts? It's like, well, that's not a good sign. The government's taking emergency measures to increase the pay of government employees so that they can keep up with the cost of housing and cost of living. But every service member that I've spoken to, morale is high. I just got an extra $400 a month. I just got an extra $500 a month. Man, this is great. I'm going to save some extra money. And to them, it's like, there's no connecting of those dots of like, well, what does this really mean? Like, and we see it again and again and again in this book. I was just looking at some of the notes that I took, page 38. It's got, as government becomes more desperate, it becomes more dictatorial. And you may not see increasing the housing allowance for government employees as dictatorial, but certainly it's a printing of money. That money comes from everybody else. That value doesn't just get created out of thin air. And so while, everybody lives in their own little narrow bubble, ourselves included, I'm not immune to that, and nobody else is either. But when you have your blinders get more and more funneled, the harder life gets. The more you're, I always use this example. When I was a kid, I used to get sick, right? I'd stay home and watch Wheel of Fortune, right? And I remember like watching Wheel of Fortune and being like, oh, God, if I could only just feel good enough to like spin that wheel, like I would be the happiest, right? Like that was like, that was my only goal, was to like be healthy enough again, as a 6-year-old watching Wheel of Fortune, to like, maybe someday I could once again feel good enough to spin that wheel. And that would be, it's so stupid. I remember having that feeling. And like, anytime you're sick, even now, I got COVID a few months ago, and I was, deathly ill in my mind. I was fine a week later, but like for that week, nothing mattered but like getting to the fridge to get a cup of, to get some water and get back to bed.
Yeah.
And in this book, it talks about, one of my favorite parts was, well, not favorite, but one of the, some illuminating parts was, it was all madness and it made the people mad, was one of the quotes. But the other one was that highly educated, it was in the prologue, basically how inflation is acute pain. So it's like a sickness. And high education was no protection. It was this woman talking about her father being very open-minded and very, very tolerant of other people and other cultures. And then as things got worse and worse, as inflation increased and got worse, and it had more effect on his life, he became anti-Semitic and eventually, abandoned all these principles that he had. So even the most strongly principled people, when acute pain is felt and you're looking for an answer, you're willing to latch on to all sorts of things that otherwise you would be able to dismiss because you're strong. And so that inflation is that disease that erodes not only your buying power, but the core principles that define you, because in a case where you're desperate, you're willing to accept a lot of things that otherwise you wouldn't have. I find that part, that quote particularly, the highly educated was no protection against these feelings, was really kind of palpable through all this. And throughout the whole book, you just get this sense of increasing madness of nobody knowing where to look, where to turn, what to trust, who to trust, and just sort of grasping at whatever straws. There's a really sad sentence in there about an older gentleman walking up and seeing a foreign tourist walking out with an apple and asking him, how much was that apple? He says 12 marks. And he's like, oh, it's too much for me, and walks off. He's kind of this shuffling man walking down the street, can't afford 12 marks, which I think was like 2 cents at the time.
And he was living
to see 12 marks and then look at the numbers they're talking about later in the book, millions of marks, billions of marks, and realizing how desperate this, old man who's just trying to live the last, years of his life with some dignity and health, and is now can't afford an apple from his local market.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to think about the winners and losers, so to speak, and the people that are clearly or losing less, I should say, not necessarily a winner, but the people that really are impacted are the ones that are getting income based on the hyper or inflating currency. So that's usually government workers. And then this particular example that John was mentioning is like, this person is living off of whatever retirement savings, or not retirement savings, but also a pension. And so he can't negotiate a higher pension amount, right? That's been baked in 20 years beforehand when he signed up to be a government worker or whatever that might be. And so it's nearly impossible to renegotiate that. But the people that tended to do better were the people that could renegotiate their salaries daily basis. So if you're a contract worker, you're going into someone's house and you're like, all right, well, yesterday it was 10 marks, now it's 50 marks, or now it's 100 marks, and always being able to renegotiate that. So they had that ability to do that, combined with the kind of the best case scenarios, being able to get income that's not denominated in your currency. So like the Lebanese, there's a really, Lebanese are going through hyperinflation, or in Lebanon, they're going through hyperinflation right now. And the people who are doing the best are the people that have, knowledge worker jobs where they're getting the US dollar as income, and they're just really winning because everything else in terms of costs, especially service things where you're paying for a service, has just fallen off a cliff. So they're, normal, salary, which was, let's say, even with everybody else 2 years ago, is now buying them 20 times as much goods and services. So in a lot of ways, they're winning out. And I think the other thing, that John kind of mentioned that resonated with me, or kind of got something going for me, is that the things that are the higher level division of labor goods. So if you're a professor, PhD professor, and you're teaching finance at a school, that is the top level of division of labor. But the basic needs of growing food and kind of those really, really basic needs are you can do better in that environment. So a farmer is a great example. Like, they're growing food, everybody needs food, they're willing to be able to sell you food, but no one's willing to buy that PhD professor's advice on what's happening in the economy at this particular time. They just need food. And so that doesn't matter. And it works its way down kind of reverse order, where, again, you're going to be a lot better off if you know how to grow food, or you can grow food. But if you're some high level, unique kind of skill set, highly educated, you just lost your total income. And it kind of works its way down from that. And you can kind of see that happening now. And I think that's good to be aware of, because, it's happening slower in the United States. So for example, my grandfather was a history teacher, and at 25 years old or somewhere around there, he was able to buy a home and provide for 4 children and a stay-at-home partner. And now I know people that got out of teaching, 2 teachers, because they couldn't afford a home and they got into other industries. And so it's interesting to see the parallels there. It's happening a lot slower here, but it is happening. And I think, that's one of the takeaways that John mentioned, and kind of resonated for me.
I'm sure somebody's created this, but there should be like a Maslow's hierarchy of jobs, right? Like, you can't have the pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy without the base layer. And to make this as simple as possible, rewind 50,000 years in human history, right? When we're just kind of getting into the agricultural period of time. Somebody came in and was like, by the way, I am a PhD in economics. I'm here to teach you some stuff about it. People be like, yeah, I'm just trying to like literally build my stone masonry hut. I don't care about that information right now. I'm not willing to pay for it. Or
I'm here to teach MMT.
Right. Or whatever other high level profession you think of that, if you because that's essentially what's happening in Weimar, is like this society is reverting to a time gone by where only essential needs is what's being serviced. And otherwise, you're not going to get paid for what you do. That's kind of how I see all this, is just this like reversion to a base layer. So you just remove any job that's above that base layer, does not matter. And
here's a counterpoint to that in the Bitcoin world. We have people like John Vallis that we just pay, and all they do is think philosophy and sit there and get information. So he's writing the opposite.
That's right,
way
the Renaissance.
where just like He starts as a humble.
But I'm
plebe
already in
and
the
then goes-
Bitcoin realm, my man. I'm
Right.
already in the Bitcoin realm.
The Bitcoin hierarchy of jobs is just fine. You know, it's
Just you're
strong.
there to sit and think, talk to
I mean,
people.
I
Bitcoin
think
philosophers at the base layer.
I think that
Also, you ain't
Bitcoin
paying me
Renaissance-
shit.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
I think that Bitcoin Renaissance is well underway and on its way. And you know, the clear parallel to that is the creation of double entry bookkeeping and Medici family in 1500s. The Italian Renaissance is to me a one-for-one result of the creative of the florin, the Italian florin, and the standardization of the Italian florin for many, many years. And that resulted in the Italian Renaissance. And I think that, I mean, I'm sure we've all talked about it before, but I think that Bitcoin Renaissance is coming, and it'll be the result of the creation of a Bitcoin standard. I hope, hopefully in our lifetime.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of the enterprise of civilization, right? Like when it breaks down, you don't have all of those manifestations of creativity and self-actualization that flourish in arts and culture and education and whatever else. You have basic needs of survival. And in the book, one of the lines that I wrote down was, people valued warmth more than honor, was kind of a commentary on how morality degrades when people are forced down that hierarchy of needs. And like, obviously that's the case. I hate it, right? Because I think we all like to think, no, I'm a principled person and I understand my morality and I will uphold my principles and values regardless of circumstance. But 99% of people, that's not true. And for those for whom it is true, they become like, in many cases, martyrs in lore. Like these are the people that died for what they thought was good and right and true. But very few people fall into that category. Most people, if they're starving, they're going to rob an apple from the fruit store. They're going to.
The best case is that they get remembered. The best case is that they're a martyr and they're still dead at the end of it, right? Like they stood up for their principles, but they're no longer with us, and hopefully they get remembered. But there's millions of people who stand up for their principles and just get washed away by the horde. Many people just forgotten to time because they stood up for their principles. Well, congratulations, you died because you didn't feed yourself or you didn't.
Right. But it's I think a beautiful commentary on what takes ultimate supremacy for them, the continuation of their own biological life, or the representation of certain perhaps eternal principles like truth, like peace, like love, what have you. Like, I think that's a very interesting conversation to have. And those people that actually make that choice in the latter, I have like the utmost respect for, even if they're not remembered by history, because I'm sure there's countless that haven't been remembered by history. And the fact that those people in those moments chose to align themselves with something more eternal than their physical body is quite a thing that very few people are capable of.
It is interesting, on that, as you were saying that, it just came to me that it was so easy to motivate everyone in Germany to do World War II or even World War I, but they weren't motivated by these principles either. And it seems like a lot of virtue signaling to go to war, right? We're going to defend or create the greater good and go invade this other country. But no one is even trying to have the actual principles of honesty and truth and some of the qualities that you mentioned. And it's interesting to think about how much higher that the war mindset, let's call it, I don't even know what need that would be, but is much higher than most people's principles and honesty and truth and things of that nature. And you can see that, in a book like this, where people are much more motivated to just go attack somebody else and go to war with some other country, even when their needs are being met. They're just like, oh, let's go invade this other country. And then, of course, I was just looking at the Weimar Republic, and like I guess they only had 1% of Jews, and then they're going to exterminate, a whole population. I mean, that's a whole nother kind of thing. So I just thought that was interesting, especially because, a little bit of what we talked about is World War I and World War II, and how Hitler came to power. And I think the biggest history question I've always had is it's obvious, like people always say they're like, oh, Hitler was really charismatic, but it was the hyperinflation that created the environment of moral decay that allowed some dummy to come in, and everyone voted him into office. Let's keep that in mind. And he won a Times Man of the Year twice. I don't know if that's necessarily something that's like an honor, or you're just kind of very influential in the world, but he won that. He's the only person who won that twice, right? And so you have Americans, Time Magazine voting him in twice. And then the other thing that's very interesting is that you go from completely destitute, losing World War I, hyperinflation in the middle, and then all of a sudden you turn around, and you have enough money and resources to fight almost the entire world. He invaded France, Great Britain, Russia, and then he wanted to attack the United States almost all at the same time. And I find that to be very interesting question, because it's like, where did this crazy person get all this money, this resources to turn this country around? One, from almost like a business practice, right? So if you can turn the country around from that to this, how did that happen? And I think that's very under thought in the space and in history, where this person just turned around a destitute country into a war machine, that can compete on a global scale.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing that's so maddening about how issues are addressed in our day and age, and probably every era, because they're so oversimplified. To your point, I mean, what the factors that coalesce, that produce the history that we've had, are basically infinite, and there's so many things that went into that. Another variable which they cover briefly in the book is how in the latter part of the 20s, Wall Street invested a fuck ton of money in Germany. And that's part of the reason why Germany was able to turn things around so quickly, from hyperinflation in 24 to basically like booming society where culture is flourishing and people are happy and healthy and all sorts of good shit is happening, 2 or 3 years later. And then as a result of the 1929 crash in, Wall Street crash and depression, then all that was sucked out. And now you've got another extremely abrupt imposition of deprivation on that same population. So think about the roller coaster in just 10 years, like come out of a war, hyperinflation, things are great. Oh shit, we're fucked again. And how fertile is that ground for someone to appeal to all of the thing that's going on, the things that are going on in someone's mind and body there. Like, you want the good life and you were hard done by these factions, and now you're deprived, and what are you going to do to feed your family, and what's the history of your country, and into that vacuum steps someone who allows you to, who gives you an answer to those questions, right? Who appeals to that impulse within you to say, you're right. It's, like, you have been wrong done by, and there, we have to find a solution to this. And to the point about like good and bad sort of thing, I think the vast majority of people who've done bad things in history, and indeed all of us in our everyday lives, I think we typically think we're doing what's good. Maybe not the highest good, but we think we're being like good and moral actors. But we may just be skewed by, of course, we're coming from the perspective of us and our family are the most important thing, more important than, you and your family are those people. So I'm going to see what I think to be good through that lens. And that's why the whole notion of good, and this involves philosophy and theology and religion and stuff, is such a tricky one, because like someone can come along, and whether it's a politician, whether it's Hitler, whether it's someone presuming to help whatever problem, they can step in and basically align with your notion of good and align with that impulse that you're feeling to resolve some situation. And I think this is, one among many reasons or ways in which these things just propagate, and things kind of start snowballing and get out of control. And before you know it, things are way past the point of no return.
Right. That before you know it, you're in the kind of outright hatred between nations or groups or whatnot, because if you're coming out of a period of such desperation, right, all it takes is a convincing politician and a government system that promises you to prop you up and bail you out and flourish you. So it's like it can be quite quick. I think that the switch into aggressive kind of not to say combat, but tension, between groups and nations. And I think as you're talking about, John, we're seeing some of that now, right? There's a lot of frustration across a whole bunch of different countries. This new leader was elected in Italy, and a lot of what she's, expressing is, very kind of internal national pride sort of concepts because of but to the point that you were making, we don't often consider the myriad of factors that get people, as upset and incensed as they become. But these are just cycles that continue to repeat, and we're seeing them again.
Yeah. And that deprivation that John first brought up is an accelerant for that, or, it makes for more fertile soil, because if you don't have the basic needs of life, you're going to gravitate towards the ideas or the people that presume to resolve that for you. And, you're going to see that as good. And, I think that's part of the reason why these things, get out of control, and people don't realize it at the time. In that book I mentioned before, I think it was They Thought They Were Free, although it might be another one. But anyways, it was an analysis of Germans living through the period of basically late 20s to mid 30s, or Hitler's rise to power. And of course, the question basically from the Western world is, how come you dummies didn't see it? And, this person was actually one of the ones that was concerned, because they interviewed 10 different people, butcher, baker, lawyer, in the 1950s, I believe. So it was still pretty fresh. And this person did see it. But what they were saying, and I think a lot of us maybe can relate to this from our experiences of the last 2 years, was they were trying to say that you seem like an alarmist, because they think you're saying A leads to Z, and that's a preposterous jump. There's a lot of stuff in there, and they just think, well, that's not plausible. When what you're saying is, no, A leads to B, and then B to C, and then C to D, and then D to E, E to F. And all those little, as we were saying before, those little moves just creep up. And by the time you get to Z, it's unrecognizable from A. And of course, you don't go from one to the other, but it's all these small steps along the way. And all those small steps represent, oftentimes, I think, a violation of certain values or principles, or an invitation to suspend your better judgment or rational thinking because of some, emotional appeal, or some special circumstance that has arisen. It's like, oh, well, only for now, right? We're only going to act this way now, and then we'll go back to later when things are resolved. And there's always an excuse to suspend rational thinking, principles, and morality. And if that is allowed to happen, I mean, you can make the case once, but if it's allowed to happen in sequence, you wind up in a place that you never thought you would wind up there. And this particular guy was saying, that's the case I was trying to make to everybody, but everyone just thought I was alarmist because they couldn't see how the A was related to. And of course, we have to recognize that it's really easy to look at history through the lens of hindsight, because we can say, oh, Weimar hyperinflation, Hitler coming to power, kind of makes sense, through all the things that we've been discussing. But what if it was 1929 and you don't have the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II to contextualize all this? That's unthinkable. You would never, that's never happened, right? So why would you think something like that is possible? You're just thinking, oh, here's this, crazy guy in Germany who gives these impassioned speeches, and he's not very popular. He a failed coup attempt in, what was it, 28 or something like that. He was thrown in jail. Just another wacko, fringe politician person. Not a big deal. We're still good. Times are great. There's a new movie in the cinema, and it's super avant-garde, and look at this architecture. We're good. With the context of what it led to, of course, it's way easier to say, oh my God, you guys are stupid for not having seen it.
Well, I think it's interesting because it's there was history that showed this. I mean, the Roman Empire is a great example. It's just not taught, and it wasn't in books. And the Chinese had the same issue, and almost every single culture had some type of inflation or hyperinflation, events. And so it's just not surprisingly well documented.
So that part for sure, there's precedent. I just kind of meant the scale of the horrors of World War II, that people, that made it more kind of egregious of looking back on it and being like, how could you not see this? But absent that, you're right, you may see these other periods of inflation and be like, guys, these typically don't work out super well. But again, this feeds into the whole notion that they wouldn't, of course, the government, but also the government wouldn't admit that it was the inflation that was causing the problems. And hey, look at today. Where the fuck are we now?
Right.
Like, look at what's happening. You know, no one is saying the obvious thing. You have the central bank governors from Canada and from the EU and from the US all saying like, oh no, this is supply chain and this is Russia. And it has nothing to do with the $8 trillion that we printed over the last 2 years. And then you've got politicians blaming the greedy corporations and the greedy CEOs, you know, so we're in the exact same scenario where nobody is pointing to the problem, or at least, you know, none of the quote unquote authorities, you know, wackos like us are pointing to it. But again, you can see why maybe they didn't revisit those prior times when the same thing had happened, because many of them were just so used to gobbling up what was told to them, and they weren't told that this was a scenario that had transpired before.
And not only that, like that's not only true, continues to be true today, but it's supported and anchored in like entire institutions, right, that are devoted to teaching modern monetary theory, right? And we give awards to the Paul Krugmans of the world and give them airtime and such. So if you're a person who isn't going to think for yourself, well, you're going to say, well, if Harvard says it, and if Krugman says it, and if the New York Times says it, you know, then you just kind of you go on with your life believing what you're fed. It's a lot of the same stuff.
And I think it's interesting that, you know, we're not taught logic and reasoning and philosophy, because one of the main things in logic is, you know, that's anti-logic, let's say, is the argument from authority, because this person said it. And we have so much of that in our society. Paul Krugman said it. It's the New York Times, Fauci, you know, the presidents, you know, either one. Like, you know, we see so many people on both sides just being like, that's what they said. This is what this person said. Therefore, as opposed to critical thinking, reasoning, and dialoguing with their peers and trying to find errors in their thinking and being open to those errors, right? Like, how am I wrong about Bitcoin? Tell me about how I'm wrong about the hyperinflation and these numbers. And we've just lost that. And then there's a, you know, kind of consensus for sure as well, where people just want to do what their neighbors and what their friends are doing and what's in the Overton window. And that's been proven over numerous times, where they'll bring, you know, they've done studies where they bring people into a room and there's smoke coming into the room and everyone just acts like it's normal. Like, you know, it's a setup, and there's one person coming in and it acts like it's normal. And that person then acts like it's normal, as opposed to there's smoke coming in, there's fire. And there's lots of examples of that where they've repeated that study and over again, which is why I love the Bitcoin community, because, you know, they might be a little aggressive in terms of calling out bullshit, where you're just trying to like eat lunch with them. You know, you're just like, I'm just trying to eat a sandwich with some bread. All right, guys, like calm down. And they're just like calling out everything. And you're like, all right, cool. Well, you know, forgive me for eating a sandwich this one time. And but it's great on the flip side for all these other reasons, right? Where the most important reasons that the most important reasons. And so it's great to have them part of that community. But it is interesting that that's where the flaw is in the logic and the reasoning and the argument from authority. And so that's where a lot of we don't learn from the past, because that's again, use cases, logic and reasoning. We just argument from authority, and that gets back to the cycle over and over again in each one of these countries. I mean, the interesting thing about this book is that there's lots of examples of this happening around the world, and maybe even in the United States at this moment, that we can pull from, but people just do not want to learn about this. And it's there for the taking. You know, the book is a little dry, but all the knowledge is right there for your people to learn.
So I just want to bring up one counterpoint to some of this. Well, I guess, I mean, this book is, you know, a pretty clear example of one of the most horrific the horrific results of what can happen from runaway inflation. And we're sort of having this conversation around like sort of assumption that that's sort of maybe the assumption that's sort of the road that we're on, the track that we're on. But I'm wondering, is there a way that we can, other than, you know, I guess there are two examples I brought up earlier. You know, you can either go the Weimar Republic way, which everything eventually collapses, the underpinning dollar collapses, and that's essentially the inevitable result of all fiat currencies. or are we in a period that's more akin to the late 70s? So like late 70s, you have a sort of extended period during stagflation where inflation goes up double digits for multiple months. And eventually Paul Volcker comes in, raises interest rates and makes it very painful, but eventually we get away from that hyperinflationary period. Is what Jerome Powell doing right now similar to what Paul Volcker did? And do we have the ability to, maybe the answer to this is that there is no escaping it in the long term because you have the removal of sound money from the underpinning, currency, and you're just pushing it further down the road. But I'm curious, if you guys have thoughts on, which period we're in or what results might be from the financial sort of steps that central banks are taking.
Yeah, I have a thought on that. Unless somebody else does, I kind of gotta
go for it. I'm sure we all do. So you go first.
Okay. It's interesting because I've thought about that as well. And what's the difference between Germany and Weimar Republic? They had a lot of debt and they had a lot of countries around them and they weren't the global reserve currency. So the difference with the United States, and it's very interesting, it seems very clear to me, but what happens when Paul Volcker raises interest rates to 18%, he sucks all the liquidity and cash out of the other economies, fiat currencies, and potential different assets, right? And so when you've got the global reserve currency jumping up to 18%, that means that everybody around the world can go into the safest investment in the market, or relatively compared to other currencies. And it makes those other currencies a lot weaker in comparison, which also triggers an event where they get out of those currencies. So if you're getting an 18%, or 5% return, let's just say 18% Paul Volcker, you're going to be jumping out of the Turkish lira at any chance you get. You're going to be jumping out of any other kind of fringe currency. And it kind of creates that feedback loop where, because everybody's jumping out of those currencies, and the same thing with the stock market, you can think about it as another kind of currency derivative. People are jumping out of that into cash and into treasury bonds by increasing that rate, and it destroys the economy. So everyone gets really scared, and then they keep piling into dollars and treasury bills. And so I guess the point that I'm making is the difference is, one, we've got the global reserve currency, so it's not going to be that acute. Two, when the interest rates increase, it destroys all the other currencies and their economies, which also allows us, you see the Dixie going through the roof right now, and every other currency, the value of the dollar is going through the roof, and all the other currencies are losing 23% of its value. Well, all that money is coming into the US dollar, which allows the US dollar, the next time they print their trillions of dollars, it's not as bad as it would have been if they didn't raise those rates and suck all that money into the global reserve currency. So that's my main thesis with how the Fed is operating in terms of interest rates. Everyone seems to say like, oh, it's unemployment rate and maybe the stock market breaking. But I think once all those other economies kind of break and all that energy and monetary energy gets sucked into the US dollar and the US treasuries, that's when they'll kind of turn from that angle. And I also, that is the difference between us and Germany. Germany didn't have that ability to do that. They had nothing. No one was fleeing into the German mark at the time. And so I think that's a huge difference, which, yeah, that's a huge difference. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. John, is it cool if I go?
Yeah.
Blake, I fully agree with Blake, and I think another kind of interesting component, I think, of and a difference between the 1970s and today, beyond the egregiously larger amount of debt and the much more painful path that everyone has as the U.S. increases rates. Beyond that, I think is the interconnectivity of the world as it is today, right? This kind of dollar milkshake theory, where our currency is going to absolutely decimate every other country that's effectively a vassal state, right? But the interesting thing to me is what happens from a game theoretic perspective as these countries wake up and say, wait a minute, what the fuck? Like, if this keeps happening, or as the Dixie keeps exploding, what's our move? Are we just going to sit here and take it, or are we going to, start to coordinate, efforts? And perhaps, and you could say we're starting to see some of this, right? And with BRICS and such. So I think there's a handful of differences, and this time around, with the pace of information as it flows across the world versus how it did in 1970, right? There's very, very, very few people who were privy to this information, globally, geopolitically relevant information. Nowadays, every, idiot with an iPhone has access to the same information. It'll be really interesting to see kind of the game theory play out between nations as the Fed does its thing, right, and potentially continues on its hiking path.
Yeah, one of the things kind of related to this that I found interesting in the book was there were periods like in 23, in 24, and this is, I said it was boring at the beginning, but this detail is definitely valuable or interesting at the least, that the mark like would have months where it would dramatically appreciate, right? So this like dramatic depreciation would reverse for a period of time. And you can just imagine like the psychology again, like toying with the psychology of the people at the time, like, oh, we're going back to normal now. We're on the upswing, right? We're on the upswing, like things are kind of improving. And then another downswing. And I think we have such a normalcy bias most of the time. Like we think things are going to either go back to the way they were or basically truck along on the same sort of trajectory that they've been on. And, I have no idea short term how all this is going to play out. Like I suspect our views are somewhat similar, but to borrow a overused term from the space, like you can't taper a Ponzi. So I don't, I think this system ultimately winds up in a similar fate, because I think from all the demands being asked of more and more people that are increasingly in a deprived state, and all the debt burden that they have, they're going to have to print, even though they know that printing is, the wrong thing to do, is sealing their fate, just as they have done in this example and as they did in so many other examples in history. Like, people in the machine know that this is a road to hell, but it's like, what's the alternative? And basically the alternative is like, well, we pull the plug now and admit that we fucked everything up, or we go with the status quo and we meet seemingly the demands of the people. We carry out the mandate of the people. Let's say people want more social services, people want more support, people want stimmy checks, people want a cap on the price of oil. Let's give it to them. That's our role as of government. We're supposed to give people what they want. So let's give it to them. And I won't be around when it breaks. And, so my perspective is, I don't know how much longer this can persist. Part of me wants not to be an alarmist and be like, oh, they'll kick the can down the road and we won't see like real disorder for another 10, 20, whatever it is years. But I'm not so sure, because if anything, this book and other examples, kind of one of its insights are, don't be so sure that you revert to the mean. Don't be so sure that you go back to normal. You may be entering into a completely other state. And that's even more the case now that we have something like Bitcoin on the scene. And I know Bitcoin is still extremely nascent for most people. And like the vast majority of people that own it probably have a little bit in a Coinbase or a brokerage account. They're not like ideologically into it like we are, but that is proceeding. And the greater the necessity, the greater the attention will be on solutions to it. And I think people will wind up in Bitcoin. And to what extent that acts as a catalyst for this being different than previous times, or this happening faster than we might otherwise think, remains to be seen. But I certainly think it's possible that it could all happen much sooner. And I mean, again, we look around on the president of Belarus. I think I saw it today, right? He's declared no more rising prices. And then you have
fantastic.
You have in the UK, I think there's a cap on gasoline or energy now, right? And so the government is gonna pay the difference. And you have all of these crazy policies happening in every country of the world that are just perfect hallmarks, perfect signposts. You could look back and see it when they've been deployed in the past, and what place on the timeline do those actions typically place the previous episode? And I would say that when they're happening on this scale and this egregiously, this nonsensically, a president just said, I declare no more price rises. When you're at that place in the timeline, I think you might be a lot closer to things unraveling than you might think. So I'm not sure how it all plays out, but this is part of the reason I'm fully in Bitcoin land, because I don't want to contend with that degree of uncertainty. I want to be in the place where I'm as insulated as possible, and I'm not trying to time anything. I'm as stable as I can be, because I don't know if it happens tomorrow or if it happens 10 years from now. And just my final point on that is, again, this part is not necessarily happening right now, but I think as the adoption of Bitcoin and as the Bitcoin ecosystem and economy grows, the degree to which capital is going to be more efficiently allocated in that space, the degree to which that ecosystem and that economy is going to outcompete the legacy system and economy, I think is going to be dramatic. And that will further put pressure on the functioning of the legacy system. Now, again, like, we're not even, that aspect of the argument would almost make me think we're further away, because I don't think that's super close to happening yet. But it's a variable. And, so I don't know how they're all going to come together to determine when we experience the type of disruption that, we've been discussing in this conversation.
Yeah, I totally. So yeah, that's the issue that I was just kind of rolling in my head. It's like, okay, how would people kind of poke back at this? And they would say, one, well, it's because of reparations, so I can dismiss it. And two, we've had similar situations in the past, like stagflation in the 70s, and we were able to come back from that. But how many times can you get back up, I think is the question. And how close are we to that point where you're running? And I think there are a lot of hallmarks in this book that we can say are happening now that maybe weren't happening in the 70s or other periods of high inflation. One of those examples is the taxes. And you talked about earlier, people who were really paying attention in Germany as Hitler was coming to power got out, right? You had to be really paying a lot of attention, and you had to have certain freedoms of movement and certain freedoms of lifestyle that allowed you to do that, right? You couldn't just, even if you did recognize it. And I think, for us, the pandemic is a perfect example where even if you recognize what was happening, in a lot of cases, there wasn't a whole lot you could do to escape some of the things that were going on. If you wanted to travel or you wanted to go somewhere, or whatever, like, there are certain things you got to produce some kind of proof of vaccine. You got to get a negative COVID test. I can't just go very easily. And in Germany, and I think some people miss this, it's like, well, why didn't people just leave as they realized it was getting bad? Well, in the beginning, you could leave pretty easily, but then very, very quickly, there was this immigration tax, right? If you want to leave Germany, that's great, but you got to give me 10% of your wealth before you go. And then it was 20%, and then it was 50%, and then it was 90%, and then it was everything, right? So if you were Jewish person living in Germany at the time, and you were like, you know what? I recognized it. This water's getting too hot. I'm out. I want to go to France. I want to go to the US. I've got people, whatever. Okay. In the beginning, no problem. Then 10%, then 20, then 30, very quickly that goes up. Now the choice is no longer stay here or leave. It's stay here and keep what I think I have in terms of my wealth, or leave and completely start over in another nation. This may be a family generations old with generational wealth that you've built over time. And now you have to completely give that entire history up in order to leave. And even if you recognize that the Holocaust was coming, even if you recognize what was, you still may not be willing to say, I'm going to give up absolutely everything that my life has been built on and that my family's life has been built on for generations to do that. And, I'm sure you guys have all heard those arguments about if Bitcoin existed, maybe maybe Hitler doesn't come to power because the people are able to escape with their wealth, with the seed phrase memorized in their brain. They're able to walk across a border with all their wealth intact instead of trying to leave and having their gold, their jewels, their art, whatever else confiscated by the Germans. But in here on page 47, and this is why, it feels like the temperature is hotter than maybe it was in the 70s, and that's sort of the taxes. But, it talks about income tax in 1921 started at 10% on the first 24,000 marks. Fast forward a couple of years, 24,000 marks is absolutely nothing. Rose to 20% on the next 60,000 marks, and so on upward until a maximum 60% was paid on all income over 395,000 marks a year. I read that number and I was like, wait a minute, didn't Biden just say that nobody over $400,000 a year would have nobody under $400,000 a year? It was like the coincidence between 395,000 marks and $400,000 in today's environment. And Bitcoiners see that number, and we all recognize $400,000 could be nothing in 10 years from now. So essentially you're raising taxes on everybody, regardless of, because that number doesn't stay fixed. That value of the dollar doesn't stay fixed, just like the value of the mark didn't stay fixed, which I just thought was, I saw that number and I was just like, oh my God. Like,
and this is why it's really like, especially, becoming a Bitcoiner or seeing, the orange light is really kind of a hero's journey, right? Because you have to, all those things and more that you just mentioned, you have to try to parse, you have to try to determine, like, what is the truth here? What is actually going on? What's right and wrong? What am I willing to give up and stuff? And the point about people leaving is like, leaving a family and a house and a job and all that stuff in Germany is a great example. Cause like when all of that is on the table and let's say you the prospect of moving to America and starting from zero, and you don't know what the hell you're going to do. You don't even speak the language, all that stuff. How sure are you that that's the right move? Like, that's a big move. So
right,
maybe things will go back to normal, or maybe it won't be so bad. Like, you just let yourself believe, because the alternative is so disruptive to your life and it's so uncertain. And it instills so much doubt in you that you're like, maybe it's not so bad. And I think part of as far as I've, my experience and people I've spoken to, part of the process of becoming a Bitcoiner and really seeing all the different ways in which money influences life, culture, politics, everything, is like reassessing each one of those things and figuring it out once again, or at least recapitulating it in some way in your mind to have greater clarity on it. And then there's this inevitable, again, as far as I can tell, analysis of morality as well. Is the existing monetary system fraudulent? Is it immoral? Why is it immoral? And so like you bump up against all these questions. And the reason why I say hero's journey, because I think this over time causes people to reconstruct themselves, reconstruct their understanding of the world, reconstruct their understanding of themselves, what they want to be in the world, the change they want to see, the things they want to be involved in, the meaning that they derive, what gives them fulfillment, all this kind of stuff. And it's no easy journey a lot of times, like it's all fun and games on Twitter, and NGU is great, but we're certainly lucky that there's like an element of levity to it all, because if there wasn't, it would just be way less fun. But
we're reading this book.
yeah. But you know what I mean? Like, I think there's a lot wrapped up in it. And basically what you're asking people to do, especially when you're so absorbed, because when that thing that you can't see, when you're the fish in the water they don't know they're in water, the monetary system is all encompassing, right? It influences the institutions that show up in society, the people that get funded, the people that have power, the idea, like just so much, as we all know. And so what you're being asked to do to see the truth, to properly respond to this scenario, is to like shake up the snow globe, to be like, wait, this worldview that I've constructed from all these signals from within this system is highly like, it's false in a lot of ways. And I need to reground it based on a greater perception of truth. And the reason why I have to do that is because if I don't, I'm probably going to be a victim of that system, that false system with all of its false signals, and the consequences that will befall me if I don't change my worldview. And changing your worldview is hard, because your worldview is how you see the world. It's who you are. And so I can certainly appreciate why it's difficult for people, but I think this is also why it's so fulfilling for so many of us, because you have that genuine feeling that you've seen the light, as it were, right? Like you're seeing things differently or more clearly. And that's like for myself, and again, many that I've spoken to, that's a very energizing sort of phenomenon to happen to you, because the world is kind of refreshed again, and there's more hope in the world, and there's more possibility in the world. And you see a solution to some of these problems that perhaps prior you felt were insurmountable. So it's a very rejuvenating and revivifying sort of experience, but it's all encompassing, I guess, is my point. And for that reason, for the reason that it's such a paradigmatic shift, I think that is what makes it so difficult for so many people to see.
Yeah. And I would, John, I would add that it, in addition to everything you just mentioned, to me, what it's brought to my life is peace, right? Like I have this deep
Totally.
sense of peace. It's really, and it's hard to describe to someone who's not a Bitcoiner, right?
It's the bomb.
Because it's
the best.
yeah,
It's so
it's
good.
like and I think if I say that to a like a normie friend, they think that I'm talking about like a number, right, or a
Yeah.
particular net worth, and it's like it's not that at all. It's this much deeper sense of security and peace, because like you said, I feel like you've stepped outside of the regimen that you were brought up in, right, and entirely reprogrammed yourself. So beyond it being, in addition to it being rejuvenating and energizing, and it's all I want to share with folks, because I really would like for my friends to understand what I understand. It's overall, at the same time, if they don't end up understanding it, I'm like, sucks for you, man, but I have a whole lot of peace. I have a whole lot of like joy and peace in my life, now, beyond, but beyond what I had before. But yeah, man, it's pretty
Isn't
remarkable.
That a trip that simply, being able to preserve the fruits of your labor in a manner that is less, more impervious to violability than any form of property up until this point is kind of what delivers that
Yeah.
what you acquire you can retain. And just
but it's when you read books like this that it articulates it so well, right? Because you see the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think the trip saved their time. I mean, that was I always come back to time, right? Like that was, I think, the most powerful thing I've learned as a Bitcoiner is like the relationship between money and time.
Yep.
Like it's time that they're stealing from you. When they print money, it's time. It's time that's being stolen from you. It's not just, oh, I'm a little bit poorer than I was yesterday. It's the time and effort you put into making that money in the first place, or saving it, or making smart investments, or thinking about what your money, it's being eradicated every time they decide to run the printing press. And it's interesting. Back then, it was so obvious, right? Because they literally had problems printing the amount of money, right? Like physically doing it was difficult. Yeah. And you could see it on the streets. Like, here's how much this brick of cash now buys me a dozen eggs, or whatever it might be. And now it's become obfuscated. It's like going to the casino. Everything's become plastic chips or numbers on a screen, or if everybody had to pay, if everybody was still paying cash for gasoline right now, I feel like people would be paying a lot more attention to the fact that gas just went up $1.10 in a week and a half in San Diego, in California. It just, I mean, one day I got gas on Friday, and a week later I got gas again. I was like, wait a minute, what just happened? Like, but if I had to, count out dollars, it's definitely more, it has been abstracted a little bit.
Yep.
And I wonder, in this digital age, because prices can change instantaneously all the time, it both makes it, it makes you feel it. In a way, it does both, right? Because you see it all the time, because numbers are constantly changing. I think gasoline is a pretty good example. My grocery bill may not change quite as quickly, but that's changed quite a bit in the last 2 years as well.
Those are just those evil capitalists, Sean.
Those damn, I know.
They're just trying to
only
making too much money.
Politicians and Pelosi and all that stuff. And then, in this book, it mentions politicians need to be seen acting, and it talks all about these different laws that were passed, and like the glutton law that was written but not actually passed, which basically punished those that were doing well. And then you have Pelosi putting forward suggesting that there'd be a government ban on all trading for Congress people, and it's like, oh, they're again, this mirage of them doing something, right? This idea that we're fighting this too. We're in this as well. And then eventually, when those things don't work, they get more and more draconian or dictatorial, or whatever word you want to use. And that's how you end up with things like Hitler in power and others, because people are willing. It's this slow sort of, well, the politicians need to do something. Oh, I'm getting poorer. Well, they're going to do something. Well, I'm getting poorer. They're going to do something. It's getting more desperate. They're going to do something. Somebody's going to fix this. Somebody's going to fix this. And to Blake's point earlier, I forget which chapter it is. I think it's in it talks about when the French went after the French and the Belgian went into the Ruhr part of Germany, and that galvanized everybody, right? Because at one point, all the chickens are running out with their heads cut off. Nobody knows who to blame. Everybody wants to fight everybody in their own community, in their own government, in their own society, whatever. And then now finally you have somebody else you can blame. And that's how these things happen, right? Like when you're so desperate, you're looking for any answer at all. And the government finally says, hey, it's not your fault. Don't look in the mirror. We're not going to look in the mirror. We can point our fingers. It's always easier to point fingers than it is to look in the mirror. Right. And this is a perfect example of that. And I think we saw that, we're seeing those pieces of social unrest, all those pre-pandemic rioting that was going on around Black Lives Matter and other sort of just general social unrest. I feel like every other week there was some protest I was watching going on. I was like, man, I know that street corner. It's no longer like, oh, it was some place that's far off or in some city that I don't recognize or whatever. It's like, I've been on that street corner. I know that area. Like that's not too far from where I am or where I was or where I've been or where I've lived. And then now I drive down, again, I live in the city and not too far from here, there are tent cities going up in places that I would have never seen that kind of living. It used to be like, oh, well, that's some neighborhood in the Bay Area, whether it's, a bad part of Oakland or a bad part of San Francisco or wherever, not where I live. But now I went to a part of the city I haven't been to in about a year and a half, not too far from where I live, and there's tents everywhere. And you're seeing the effects of inflation on a daily basis, and we get used to it, and we but then we eventually, when it gets so bad, we expect the government to do something about it, and then they play their role of, well, we're going to pass a new tax, or we're going to pass a new law, or we're going to pass and that's going to fix it, or we're going to pass an emergency stopgap measure, and that's going to fix it. And eventually you run out of, you just keep going, and the emergencies get more and more frequent, and you lose less and less of your sovereignty and your autonomy. And last time John and I did one of these, it was on Bastiat's law, and you talk about, plunder versus production, and like the government continuously is on the side of plunder. And, Atlas Shrugged is a book that I did not read for a very, very long time until, maybe a year or so ago. And so much of what's happening right now is was predicated or believed in the philosophies of Ayn Rand. And we're seeing it all the time. And when I try to bring these things up with people who aren't paying attention, when I say things like, the government of California banning combustion vehicles is a really bad thing. And they're like, what are you talking about? Why is it a bad thing? I'm like, I'm not saying that electric vehicles are bad. I'm saying that the government deciding that they're bad, that deciding that combustion vehicles are bad, is a really, really dangerous, slippery slope. The kind of thing that ends governments altogether, the kind of thing that makes irreparable harm and decisions to the people of a certain place, the kind of thing that makes people say, you know what, I don't want to live in California anymore, which we're seeing in droves, right? During the pandemic, people left California, go to Texas, go to Florida, go to places that spent more time catering to the people that live there rather than trying to prop up a government or a system that's been built over 50 or 100 years. And as Bitcoiners, I feel very lucky because I feel like I'll always be able to, in some way, shape, or form, be able to vote with my feet. And I think the book Sovereign Individual highlights that to a much greater extent, that we are in this new era of technological and financial separation that allows us to say, you know what, I'm going to go live somewhere where they treat me good. And that is the real change here. It's like, that's the real difference for me, at least the way that I see it. Is like in the future or now, I can say, you know what, you're not treating me well here, and you don't treat me, my money, my time, my energy well, I can go somewhere else. And so for that, I have hope. And I think, whether it's you listen to something that Tomer Strolite said or watch, whether it's generational wealth, whether it's, this sci-fi, the really out there Bitcoin stuff that gets into the psychedelic, the spiritual, the stuff that I love talking about, like the 100 years, 200 years, 10,000 years down the road, like what does this society look like? And what does society look like built on a Bitcoin standard? I think, John, I talked about this. One of my favorite conversations of the year last year was you and Tomer talking about what the world could look like, and how, and I think this, again, these things always highlight it, is like, okay, so we know what a society looks like on strong money. What does it look like on the strongest possible money? And that's Bitcoin. And so for those reasons, I will always have hope, even in the face of reading things like this or seeing examples of, our society sort of dipping into the same problems that we've had in the past. Like, okay, let's try something new. And now we actually happen to live in a place where there is something truly new, not just evolutionary, not just, oh, it's a new technology is going to help, not just a stopgap of like, oh, well, Paul Volcker and now Powell's going to raise rates. Like talking about real, completely new, novel thing that exists on the planet that has never existed before, and that's Bitcoin. And something I've always tried to explain to people is like, you don't understand that like this is not just some new thing. It's not just a new way of transferring information. It's not just the internet that speeds things up or new money or new payment system, whatever. It is a truly novel thing that exists on the planet, has never existed before, and hopefully ushers in the world, the sci-fi future that we have seen or talked about or read about or watched in movies or whatever. And I think we're going to see more and more art based around that. And that's really what's powerful is the memes and the art. If you can create popular, powerful stories around memes and art, then maybe, and that, that's how we get our vision and eventually.
I think this is part of the reason for that levity that we see, right? Because you look out on the world with those fresh eyes and you're like, holy shit, it is so fucked. Like it is just outrageous on so many levels. Oh, thank God I have Bitcoin, like you're just like, oh, and like you can't, the only natural response is to laugh at how absurd it all is, but also how, I hate to sound, I know this sounds like a bit like a dick, but how capable you are now of insulating yourself from it. Because John, to your point, like if you compare yourself to that person wanting to leave Germany who had the house and the job and the family and like all that stickiness, now you can be way more confident in your ability to respond to things, and you can be more calm as a result, and you can be more, lighthearted because like, well, if a line is crossed, I'm out and I can get out. I can sell my house, turn the proceeds into Bitcoin, sell all my assets, put it in Bitcoin, throw it in my brain, and I'm gone. And if I can, get over a border or, be smuggled somewhere, then I'm good. And just having that as even an emotional or anxiety release valve in this day and age where like clown world is fully in your face at every turn is, I mean, you can't help but bring a smile to your face, right? And I think the other thing I wanted to mention was the language has been so co-opted. We say inflation, and to your point, John, it is a theft of time. Right? Inflation sounds like such an innocuous term. Oh, it's like an economic term that economic people talk about, and like that's not really my bag, so I don't have to worry about it. Instead of saying it's someone who's literally stealing from you and making it so that your time is no longer your own, right? You have to devote time to this person who's stealing from you that you don't even know them or know what's going on. And even that's a bit innocuous because like time is kind of amorphous, but what we mean by that is like the totality of your potential is what is contained within time, and so you're referencing like, what does the world look like in 50 years, 100 years time, when we have that degree of stability, when we're well into that Renaissance period where people are so, we discussed this a few minutes ago, we're so calm because we have a certain, a higher degree of certainty around an aspect, one of the most important aspects of our life, i.e. finances, our ability to move through the world. We have more confidence over that into the future, further into the future than we've ever had. And so what does that allow us to release? Okay, I don't have to worry so much about all these different worries, anxieties, uncertainties that I used to have. What's within me that I can now try to tease out? And how much does that enrich my life? How much does that enrich my family's life, my communities, the world? And so when there's that theft through inflation is not just meaning you got to work more to pay the bills at the end of the month. It means that you're being deprived of all that, effectively the collective human potential that we might discover in ourselves and transmute into the world as a result of being so secure in the basic needs of life, that we can then layer on top of that and see how high that hierarchy goes. What's at the top of that human potential or actualization hierarchy? That's what I think the Renaissance is going to be representative of. And I think that's always been the case, right? And so inflation is the counterforce to that. It's the thing that's impeding that. That's what's being taken from every individual and from us as a collective humanity. And, I think it's time, well, we all do, so I'm not preaching to us, but that it's just another example of how the language is intentionally used to obfuscate what's really going on and who's really responsible for it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Blake. Go ahead.
It's interesting that I think John, you mentioned earlier with the goalposts, like you see the goalposts, and I think that's what's amazing about this book. It shows that you're the frog being boiled, going back to our earlier analogy, and you just see it getting warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer. And that's the beautiful thing about this book, is that you can see those goalposts really well. And also it articulates the inevitability of how the system reinforces itself until collapse, right? It keeps going and keeps going and going, which, if you're in the Bitcoin community, that gives you confidence for a lot of reasons, because everyone's going to have to get off their sinking Titanic and get onto your lifeboat. But your lifeboat just isn't a lifeboat. It's a party carnival cruise barge with free drinks and food, and it's a lot better, and you're just waiting for everyone to kind of wake up. And so that's the interesting thing from a security standpoint. Not only is inflation theft of your time, but it's also theft of your consciousness and your security, and you living in a higher level state of security, and whether you have however many Bitcoin you have, or partial fractions of the Bitcoin, you can be confident that you can have that for the foreseeable future into 20 and 30 years from now, and it's not going to be inflated away or stolen. And that's something that really impacted me in 2008 when the stock market crashed, and everyone's using the stock market as their piggy bank, and they lose 80% of their net wealth. And in this book, it was that one pensioner gentleman that was trying to buy an Apple. He's lost everything, and that's been taken from him, and he doesn't even know how to get his basic needs met and to buy an Apple. And that's the beautiful thing about Bitcoin. To me, this seems inevitable rather than a probable, and if you look through history, it's guaranteed to continue to happen, and it's always happened. And now we have this new system that is nuclear proof, right? Like that is just unstoppable. And then you have Seyfedin's book in the monetary history.
John. John's got to bail. Sorry, Blake.
The monetary history of why the strongest money always wins. And you can rest your laurels on those kind of very principled economic things in the history of monetary science or fiat currencies inflating away. And I think that's something, trying to make some of this more actionable for the average plebe or the average listener, where it's like, what do they do? And I think that's a big frustration that I have with most content out there, is that there's not a lot of actionable things. And I think maybe we can talk a little bit about that, where obviously one solution is to buy Bitcoin, but maybe we can, talk about that, but also just kind of other solutions as you guys might see them, and make that more actionable for the average person, whether that's kind of being conscious of those flags, or, one of the things that is coming to mind as I'm saying this is that the real estate market in my city went up by 40%. And more people were making money from their real estate than they were from their jobs. They just owned a home, and it, increased in 40%. So you've got $1 million home. Now you just made $400,000 from that home. That to me really shows that money is dying, and that we are in that state, and that's undeniable. It's another flag in that kind of road that we're traveling down. And I'd love to hear what you guys think about just kind of potential solutions, or how you see those flags, and then you're going to continue to make a decision, whether you're into Bitcoin now, if you're doing kind of more of a leverage real estate play that Michael Saylor talks about, or you also are thinking about, hey, when do I get out of my city, my state, my country, and how you're thinking about that. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And maybe, Kirsten, since you came from El Salvador, I think, or your family's from El Salvador, maybe you have an interesting perspective on that, especially since that's a Bitcoin community.
Yeah. Actually, it's great that you bring that up. Just to tie in a couple of things, everything you were just asking, along with some of the jurisdictional stuff we were talking about earlier. I think John was saying, hey, we have the freedom to be like, I'm going to take my wealth and I will march out of this state or march out of this country to wherever I want to go. It's interesting. I've been a Bitcoiner. I've been a saver in Bitcoin. I would say I began saving in Bitcoin in a meaningful way, 2018, 2019. So I'm kind of from that vintage in terms of being a saver. And fast forward all the way to 2021. and I hear this announcement, right, that my country, of all the countries in the world, it's mine, that's kind of taking this leap forward. And I got to tell you, instantly, I recognize the importance, again, from a jurisdictional perspective, because I live in the States, but instantly I realized I have to have all my shit in order for this world that I presume, for the world as I presume it to be in 5, 6, 7, 10 years, right? I want to make sure that I have the, as Katie the Russian calls it, plan B, right? My plan B, passport, and my pathway to another, jurisdiction, should I, need that to happen. So I think I'm fortunate in that I have, birthright citizenship, so getting a passport was pretty easy, and that kind of thing. But I think as Bitcoiners, we have to think about giving ourselves those options, creating those jurisdictional options for ourselves. It doesn't necessarily have to be El Salvador, but and everyone can do their own research as to what jurisdiction makes sense for them. But I do anticipate a world in which things get more wobbly, and it's not a done deal, or it's not a given, that our particular country is going to be amenable to Bitcoiners now and forever, right? Political winds might change, right? And that's an unfortunate part of the proof of stake kind of, political system, right? It's like you get a different administration that feels differently about proof of work protocols and Bitcoin mining and things like this, and suddenly all of us find ourselves in a different, scenario. So I think about, and I've been really fortunate, to kind of be in this kind of Salvadoran context. And like I told my family, like jokingly one day, but I'm like, we have like a local airport here, like one of those small regional airports, like a couple of miles away from our house. And I'm like, if ever this government says proof of work is banned, we'll get our shit together and get out of here, as soon as possible. But yeah, no, not to be alarmist or anything, but again, we've talked about this earlier too, right? Some of us sound like crazy alarmists to our normie friends, but if we do see a world kind of like, Weimar Germany, where things in extremely short order get very disorderly for folks, then I would say I would encourage any Bitcoiner to think about now, not then, but now, start to do your research and prepare, a path to a different jurisdictions should you need it, regardless of where you happen to be. I'm not just talking to American, Bitcoiners, but regardless of where you are, so yeah, I would, that I guess that's a little bit about.
Yeah. So everyone's situation with assets and investments and stuff is different. So like, I try to keep it simple. Like, I think one, in these times, being as adaptable as possible is probably a positive thing. Now, as possible, who knows what that really means, but kind of knowing how you would navigate circumstances should they shift rapidly. And I think, for the average person, continuing to work, providing value, refining the way in which you do so, and then siphoning whatever savings are available outside of your expenses and whatever into Bitcoin. And it's not sexy. You're not a trader. You're not going to get the Lambo. You're not going to get the big 100X, but I just think, well, yeah, you eventually probably get the Lambo, but point being is like, taking the humble approach to this, where you we're moving into, if we're right about this, hyper Bitcoinization is going to be a landscape where more and more merit and true value is rewarded, and not all this rent seeking and trading and paper gains and all this kind of stuff is. And so become a person who's aligned with that, who's ready to move into that system and provide whatever value it is you're capable of providing, and continue to try to refine the manner in which you do so. And then be rewarded by the people who see the value in that, and take some of those rewards and put it in, put it in Bitcoin to accrue all the benefits that, some of which we've touched on here, that peace and that security and that comfort and that growing optionality over time. Because, as we all know, I think that'll be the way to do it 100 years from now. It just happens to be the case, where we are in the kind of S curve, that it's probably going to be extra rewarding in terms of the purchasing power that you're able to accrue as a result of taking that strategy with your savings. So and it's tough, right? Because so many people are in such difficult situations, all around the world, but in the US and developed countries as well. Like a huge portion of people live paycheck to paycheck, right? So it's difficult to convince them, like, play the long game, just another 20 years and things will be good. But if they don't play it that way, they're going to wind up 2 steps back most often. If they try to go into the casino, whether it's an actual casino or a shitcoin casino or whatever, some get rich quick, whatever, they're going to wind up in a worse situation. So if they just kind of try to get their life together, try to eradicate or limit unnecessary expenses, try to continue to refine who they are as a person and what value they provide to the market, and then take those savings and put them in Bitcoin and just keep and do that consistently. Do that. And, you know, next year will be better than this year. And isn't that a victory? And then the following year will be better than that year. And then 5 years from now will be better than now. It's not as sexy. And you're going to see on Instagram and your friend, and like, you know, you're going to see all the bullshit fiat stuff that is thrown at you a million times a day. You got to ignore that. And you got to say, you know, like, what is in alignment with my principles and values and what I think is most likely to occur? And what are the tools at my disposal? I should engage them to try to bring about the best circumstance for me. And I should be humble and patient in my doing that, because I recognize that not being that way is going to be detrimental to me, I think is the right way to play it.
And John, I think it's one of the challenges of kind of expressing this to folks is that we've all been brought up in such a fiat minded, like a short, you know, time horizon minded sort of way, that is so difficult for all of us to wrap our heads around when we're kind of unplugging ourselves from that regimen, right? It's like, wait, you mean to tell me all I need to, what I actually should be doing is providing value to the world and not expecting some, you know, some payout immediately, you know, but rather in its due time. It's so counter to how, you know, our whole generation has been brought up. It's really, really difficult, and it's further complicated by the kind of the broader digital asset or crypto, you know, world that promises you immediate gratification and immediate returns, when that's in fact not at all what this philosophy is about, right? But I think once a person does start to internalize, wait a minute, how am I being valuable to the world? What am I doing that's making that? What am I offering to the world that is of value, right? That's perhaps a slow process, you know, for folks, but that's the real work, I think. Once a person begins to see themselves as part of an ecosystem where it's like, hey, I'm here to show up and contribute value. You know, that's what I'm here to do. Wow. Once we slowly start to do that, then folks become, you know, savers and then Bitcoin, you know, savers in Bitcoin and such. But it's such an uphill battle, I think, to get people out of like a short time frame sort of mindset, you know, and into one that is selfless and patient and focused more on what I contribute to the world, what value I bring to the world, rather than what I can take from it.
And that social contract, as it were, being reestablished, actually delivers so much more than just, you know, your purchasing power, as many Bitcoiners will attest. Like, and Harrison, you said about like the peace and the stability you feel, like those and the relationships you end up building with people and the way you value and the things that you get fulfillment and enjoyment out of, like a lot of that can change, and that can be very material and can be rather rapid increases or influences in the quality of your life. You know, maybe your savings account nominal amount didn't grow by a tremendous amount, but you still, something of tremendous value is starting to dawn on you just as a result of engaging in this process. And the flip side of that is when, you know, in these places and times, the one we're in, 1920s Germany, when that quote unquote contract, and perhaps that's not the right word to use, but I think you'll know what I mean, is like when the premise of, hey, work and provide value and receive reward, which you and only you can avail of the fruits of, people have an attitude of working and of contributing and of building. But when that's removed, you get that nihilism that we see is so prevalent today, you know, and the debauchery that was so prevalent in 1920s Germany, because like, well, what's the fucking point? Like, why would I do that? Like, it's not going to pay off. So I don't care. So I'm going to get my kicks now. I'm going to try to gratify myself immediately. And again, like, I mean, that's on full display in I think in the world today. And it was also on display in the mid to late 20s in Germany. You know, I saw some interesting photos, not that this is perfectly representative, but it just jogged my memory as I was preparing for this. Like you could see like the jazz and cabaret dancing thing was big in mid to late 20s Germany. And you could see there was, what's that?
It was the twerking of the time.
Yeah, and you could see these like cabaret dancers. There was photos of them buying cocaine off drug dealers in the street. Now they looked a little bit more civilized than, you know, their contemporaries today do, but still, like you had that same behavior taking place where it was a shrugging off of, it was a repudiation of what was on offer. It was saying, this is fucking bullshit and this is not working and everyone's lying and everyone's corrupt and there's no one's keeping up their end of the bargain here. So I'm just going to get my kicks and fuck you. And the last thing I'll mention about that is what's interesting too, that I thought was, and I'll use kind of a funny corollary to today, but one of the things that sprung up simultaneous to that, like kind of aura of debauchery was, this is a quote from the book, in 1927, outbursts of physical exercise attempted to become strong, of people attempting to become strong and beautiful, occurred simultaneous to this debauchery, right? And I see that as like a certain cohort or a certain demographic of that time saying, we need to counterbalance this disorder, this chaos that we're seeing. And the way we do that is we become strong and stable and, you know, more capable of confronting this disorder and chaos. And again, I think there's corollaries today where a certain group of people, and perhaps Bitcoiners are among them, were saying like, there's a lot of chaos and tradition has been, you know, all of our traditions and principles and norms have been just eliminated in favor of this, you know, crazy woke ideologies and all sorts of other problems. I need to take some of it back, right? I need to make my mind and my body and my immediate circumstance as strong as possible. And the image that's entering my mind for this example is like a couple days ago, I saw that Tucker Carlson, he's doing these like original documentaries now. And one of them was like this strong men series, right? Where he's got like guys are working out and wrestling and slonking raw eggs and tanning their balls and stuff like that. And like, it seems absurd, but number one, like most of that shit I'm down with. And number two, like you can see how that seemingly extreme sort of set of behaviors, maybe it's fairly, I can see it as a fairly rational response to the complete degradation and disorder that they're facing out in the world. And so creating more order within oneself is a natural response to seeing disorder out in the world, at least for a certain cohort of people. The other cohort engage in the disorder and allow it to make themselves disorderly and debauched. But I think you're always going to have those two responses. And I found it so interesting that you could see it in 1920s Germany. And I think we have a lot of parallels today.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Hey guys, I'm sorry. I just gotta let you know I'm gonna have to get going in like about 2 minutes. I gotta go at 5:15.
Sure. I think we can shut it down. My last comment, I'll end on a slightly positive note, although I think there's a lot of good stuff here. One of the things I found interesting, I mentioned it a little while back in the conversation, was just that from the end of the war to like 1924, where that was the peak of the hyperinflation, like that was a super extreme circumstance. And then 2-3 years later, it was basically like things were on the up and up. Like there was a lot of weird cultural stuff, but like the middle class had recovered and most people were more stable. And I bring that up only to say, like, I think we all agree that there's kind of a storm on the horizon, because now this fiat experiment is global and it's not just isolated, and it's been brought to a level that, you know, perhaps there is no precedent for just how extreme it's become. And so the unwind is probably going to be a sight to behold as well. But now that we have, you know, this tool in Bitcoin to respond to it and to protect ourselves from and to feed into as a parallel system, I'm optimistic that as bad as it might be, I think we might be able to come out of it rather quickly, you know, because there's been times in the past where they came out of it quickly and they had nowhere near the type of tool that we now have at our disposal. And so, that's my last optimistic comment, and I'll throw it over to you guys for a final word before we shut it down.
Love that, man. Well, oh, sorry. No, well, listen, I just wanted to thank you, John. This is super cool to talk to Bitcoiners and to specifically to touch on this book, right? And to revisit this book that I think we've mentioned it a bunch of times here. It's a little bit dry, but I would say it's to me it wasn't that dry. You know what I mean? I think it's very much worth Bitcoiners' time or anybody's time to revisit this period in Weimar Germany, because again, as we kind of said at the very beginning, a lot of times it's easy to kind of read something like this and be like, oh my God, thank God that's never going to happen again. But yet we have to be really eyes wide open, because I think in a lot of ways what's bound to happen might be even worse, considering the global interconnectivity, that we experience today. So thanks very much for pulling us together and for going over this book.
Yeah, and for me, I think it's interesting to try to think about, someone that's maybe kind of newer to this space, and like what's this a solution or solution? What can people do to get out of it? And I think about somebody like young in their career, 25 years old, and what can they do? They see the writing on the wall, they agree with us, but they haven't made that much income, or maybe they're even 22 or 21. And I think about that. It's interesting because I know Michael Saylor is really doing the speculative attack, which is you're now leveraging an asset which used to be a liability, which is debt. So in any inflating environment, if the dollar or a currency is inflating by 10 or 20%, and you can take a loan out for 3%, you can take that and buy that strong asset. And so, Michael Saylor is doing that with Bitcoin. And then the other interesting thing is a lot of people are doing that with real estate, and they don't even know they're doing it. They're taking out a large mortgage, putting as little percent down as they can, taking out a large loan, and then that debt is being inflated away over time, and the value of the house is going up, as well as the rents are increasing, so the cash flows are going up. And I think that's like something that seems actionable in a learning that's reinforced by this book and the last 70 years of asset appreciation. And the only difference with like not putting that into Bitcoin, which you can do, I know there's people that do take loans out and then put that into Bitcoin, especially thinking about it for someone that's 25 years old, because let's say they make $100,000 a year, they're going to make $2 million over a 20-year career. But if that money is being inflated away, their future cash flows are being diminished. And Michael Saylor recognizes that. And I think that's something that needs to be put in the forefront, because, as Michael Saylor says, you're on a treadmill. If your inflation continues to increase by 10 or 20% and you're not getting a 10 and 20% raise, you're moving backwards in terms of purchasing power. And until somebody realizes that and it clicks for them, then they don't understand that they need to subtract the inflation rate by the interest rate or their salary each year, because their purchasing power is becoming worth less, not the cost of goods increasing necessarily, but the thing that their cash flows of their job for the next 10 years is diminishing. And I just kind of wanted to end on that note, because I like to make it actionable for people to kind of do something. So that's my takeaway, and hopefully that gives some people some clarity.
Yeah, definitely something to explore. Lots of ways to play these crazy financial times that we're in. But I will just start with stay humble, stack sats. Gentlemen, thank you very much, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Okay. Thanks again, Tom.